No, we're gonna get started. So on the screen in the upper right-hand corner, we have Alan Front, who is without a doubt the most legendary conservation lobbyist of our time. I promise you that Alan usually is larger than life. His little screen square up there is smaller than usual. But we are going to hear from Alan about public funding. And then after his initial presentation and color commentary, Peter Howell and I will jump in. We'll have a little conversation, and we are looking forward to time for question and answers. And then we have lunch. So on that note, Alan, take it away.
All right, I'll speak quickly if I and my colleagues are what stand between you and a good meal. I am Alan Front. I wish I were with you in New Haven. Instead of being at Croon Hall, I am in Northern California this morning at my home. The only thing that could keep me away from you all is, my dear, I know I'm there. Am I out of control again here? The only thing that would keep me is the birth last week of a second granddaughter and my daily duties as the man known as Bop Bop. So I am here in my hometown of San Anselmo, California, live streaming to you. San Anselmo is known as both the antique capital of the Bay Area and as a destination for restaurants. And both of those are really appropriate for our discussion this morning, partly because after 40 years in the conservation community, I am something of an antique myself. And when it comes to the food side, what I'm going to offer this morning is what my friend and local chef, Ron Siegel, who is a Michelin star chef, so he knows what he's talking about, would call an amuse-bouche. I am not going to give you an exhaustive appetizer to dessert description of federal funding. Instead, I'm going to give you some samplings, a taste, just to whet your appetite and hopefully excite your palate a little bit about what's possible in the world of federal conservation funding, and then leave it to a couple of my very respected and beloved colleagues who are there in the room with you, Walker and Peter, to serve up the meal, to actually talk to you a bit more about federal conservation funding and how to get it, to talk to you about the utensils that you might use, if I can beat the horse of this metaphor, to spoon some of that federal conservation funding up onto your plate. I'm going to tee that up by talking to you about the way federal conservation funding has been and the way it is now, and some of those changes and what they mean for what you can bring to your projects. Once again, I'm afraid that there we go. Forgive me for being not the most technically proficient person who's talking to you this week. But I will, from that historic graybeard perspective, talk to you about conservation when I started 40 years ago. Federal conservation was really about protecting federal places. It was about national parks and national forests and national wildlife refuges and areas of critical environmental concern. In the upper left part of your screen, an iconic project on the island of St. John in the Virgin Islands, connecting with a 417-acre, $30 million acquisition, Land and Water Conservation Fund dollars, connecting the two disjoint parts of Virgin Islands National Park. In the upper right-hand corner of your screen, 3,800 acres on the slopes of the Haleakala volcano, connecting Haleakala National Park to the Pacific Ocean on the east shore of the island of Maui. On the southwest corner of your screen, appropriately in the southwest corner of our great nation, the Red Rocks of Sedona, largely publicly owned, even when I started at the Trust for Public Land in 1984. But what hadn't been done was the protection of 150 acres that established and expanded a campground that provides the only public camping opportunities in that otherwise protected national forest landscape. In the southeast of your screen, in the southeast portion of America, the Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area, which way back when was just a collection of pocket parks in Atlanta. And with federal conservation funding, national park ownership in concert with state and local acquisition and conservation and restoration, has become a 150-mile greenway running through Atlanta to the north and south. Well, again, these projects, as you look at them, they're what I used to consider federal conservation. Let's buy something federal and make it available for federal constituents to federally recreate. That has changed over time. And so what you see, and I'm delighted to have Peter Stein in the room because he and I and a few other souls worked on the project that you see in snow on the upper left-hand corner of your screen now. That project would not have been possible without the creation of the Forest Legacy Program in 1990 Farm Bill, a program that didn't just look to protect land for conservation as we knew it, but also looked for in a unique way to prevent conversion of forest land for the various benefits that forests provide. So yes, it's about recreation for a skier or an occasional snowshoer, but it's also specifically about protecting forest land for continued forest production as well as for forest values. Transportation money. You're looking now at a Highline Trail through Chicago that connects some disadvantaged communities in Chicago to the downtown, using $50 million of transportation money under the CMAQ program, the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program. Never would have thought that that was a conservation program. Now it is. Conservation programs in the Department of Agriculture, which have grown in size and scope. There are now very fluent easement programs, very well-used easement programs that cover a huge swath of conservation in America that didn't exist when conservation in the Department of Agriculture was just support payments and conservation reserve program enrollments that people could pull out of at any time. Mitigation money. This is a land return project in Oregon that actually brought the Nez Perce tribe back to lands from which they'd been exiled in the Nez Perce Wars of the 1870s, using federal power company mitigation money to buy two key ranches, the Cottonwood Creek Ranch and the Chief Joseph Ranch, to bring the Nez Perce back into their native homelands. So a lot of these new programs and these programmatic expansions, this expansion of the concept of federal conservation, comes from some very deliberate decisions that have been made in Washington. Legislation that has increased the size and scope and reliability of federal funding, like the Great American Outdoors Act that I'll talk about in a minute, specific to conservation, and other decisions that have grown funding, not necessarily for conservation, but for conservation-aligned programs like transportation programs and hazard mitigation programs that could be used for conservation, or they could be used for gray infrastructure. We're going to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act a little bit, and the bipartisan infrastructure law, and about the Great American Outdoors Act and other things that have increased that federal spending. But I want to just take a global view for just a second to talk about federal spending, how that itself has changed over the years and how that affects conservation. This is your civics test of the day. You're looking at the pie chart for federal spending in fiscal 23, the current fiscal year. I want to take us back to the middle 2010s, to the end of the Obama administration, the beginning of the Trump administration. Does anyone have an idea, and shout it out if you do, of how much money the federal government was spending in 2015 or 2016 on everything? Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, airport and highway trust funds, interest on the debt, defense spending, domestic discretionary spending. Anyone have a clue of roughly how much we were spending just 8 short years ago? I don't hear anyone shout.
Alan, there are a lot of heads shaking.
Okay, well, I'll answer the question by saying that we were spending at the beginning of the Trump administration, end of the Obama administration, about $4.1 trillion a year on everything. How much do you think we're spending now in this post-COVID world? $6.8 trillion this year, more than half again as much money as we were spending just a few years ago. Now, you'll see in the legend here that there's a green square that says conservation. Unless your eyes are much younger and much better than mine, you probably don't even see the green sliver that I will give you a visual aid for. It's right there in between purple and blue. When federal spending was about $4 trillion, I would calculate with everything all included that we were spending about $8 billion a year, about 0.2% of the federal budget on conservation. Now the federal budget is $6.8 trillion. It's half again as much. And I would say that we probably, if we do it right, are spending not $6 or $8 billion, but more like 15, 16, 18 billion dollars on conservation. We've increased the possibility of federal conservation from 0.2% of $4 trillion to 0.25% of $6.8 trillion. And whether or not you can make use of that money depends on some very specific decisions that are made in some very specific federal conservation programs. I promised you amuse-bouche and not meal. And so I'm going to very quickly survey what I hope is a listing on this and 2 succeeding pages. I'm hoping that you have this in hand, or you'll have a printout of this and be able to refer to it at your leisure, because I'm not going to dwell on it. But I will tell you that every place where you see a bright green heart is a place where Congress has made a decision to increase conservation funding through legislation. Every place where you see a crosshatched green heart, that's where externalities have increased funding. So for instance, the first 5 programs that you see on this page are Land and Water Conservation Fund funded programs that are increased because of the Great American Outdoors Act that, again, I'll talk about in a minute. You also see the Migratory Bird Conservation Fund here, which was doubled in recent years because of a specific piece of legislation that was passed that I'll talk about in a second. And then you see Pittman Robertson and Dingle Johnson, the Sport Fish and Wildlife Restoration Funds, which do a lot of acquisition on a state basis. It's federal money. That federal money hasn't been increased by Congress. It's been increased because the funding source is going up. Those programs are funded through the sale of fishing tackle and guns and ammo. It turns out people are buying more rods, more reels, and way more guns and way more bullets and shells than they used to. And that is benefiting conservation. Here you see another list of programs, including the Forest Legacy Program, which I mentioned a little earlier. Forest Legacy Program benefits not only from the Great American Outdoors Act, but also from the Inflation Reduction Act, which plunked down a one-time infusion of $700 million into that specific program, which is going to allow for programmatic spending that we haven't seen before. This is a moment for federal conservation. Similarly, all these ag programs that you see with green hearts in the middle and toward the bottom of the page, those are all funded with substantial additional funding that, again, I'll talk about in a minute, through the Inflation Reduction Act. It's climate funding, climate-focused funding that's increasing funding for agricultural easement programs. NOAA has another $2.6 billion that they don't know how to spend yet that came through the Inflation Reduction Act. And the Department of Defense has a program that we'll talk about that has jumped from $10 million, $15 million in its early years in the early 2000s to almost $200 million a year today for the REPI program that we'll be talking about. Last but not least, on this quick survey of federal opportunity are an agglomeration of programs that I would call resilience programs, where money can be spent, but isn't necessarily spent on green infrastructure, on conservation, on restoration and bioswales. It instead can be spent on seawalls and concrete. But if we do it right, the additional BRIC money and hazard mitigation grant money that came to to FEMA and the Homeland Security Department through the bipartisan infrastructure law of 2 years ago is available for conservation. Similarly, you go down the page, you see these EPA funds, the state revolving funds, and you're going to hear a lot more about those later on this week, but I'll mention them again a little later on in this half hour. Billions of additional dollars available for conservation. Similarly, the EPA, that's through the bipartisan infrastructure law. EPA also got an infusion of cash, almost $3 billion for climate justice grants that go to disadvantaged communities. And they've just put out NOFOs, Notice of Funding Opportunities, on how that money can be spent in ways that include conservation. Last but not least, I'll just mention that there is transportation money, these new programs, about $10 billion of new transportation funding that was provided in the bipartisan infrastructure law, much of which is available for conservation. Again, I'll touch on it at the end of my brief remarks this morning. And disaster funding that comes through the Army Corps of Engineers at the top of the page and HUD at the bottom of the page through the Disaster Relief Fund. Every time there is a disaster, there's an opportunity for more conservation funding. So I am now breathless from talking to you about all of that, but it should give you a sense that there is more money out there than you can shake a stick at, more money than we've ever seen before for federal conservation spending. And one charge that I want to issue to you is that at the end of this week, you will be among the best educated conservationists in America, which means that you have an incumbent obligation to make hay while the sun shines, to take advantage of these funds before they disappear, and they're at risk of disappearing. I'm going to run through a couple of those programs right now, just a couple of those programs. But LWCF really it needs no introduction. It's federal land acquisition funding. It's grant money to states for state parks, for wildlife and habitat protection, for forest legacy and forest protection, for battlefields, for urban parks. It used to be subject to appropriations. It isn't anymore. It's now mandatory because of the Great American Outdoors Act that was signed by this man, sitting among all of those masked members of Congress and agency folks. As a result of the signing of the Great American Outdoors Act that makes the Land and Water Conservation Fund permanent, and instead of getting $2 or $3 or $4 or $500 million a year through appropriations, now gets $1 billion plus, regular as rain every year, guaranteed. That guarantee is allowing the National Park Service to do what it's been trying to do for 20 years and finish off a $100 million acquisition in the heart of Grand Teton National Park, buying state school lands in the middle of the park on the Snake River. Near where you're sitting today, it's led to substantially increased funding for the Conti National Wildlife Refuge, which covers the Connecticut River watershed across 4 states. And not all that far from where I'm sitting today, it's protecting at greater rate, greater acreage, greater response time, much quicker, is securing more and more of the threatened inholdings in the checkerboard in the California Sierra Nevada. The state grants that I talk about for parks, for ball fields, for battlefields, for all kinds of other fields, for historic sites, for recreation areas and natural areas. This program 10 years ago was getting $40 million a year. The formula grants programs, the program that goes to every state and every territory, is now getting about $300 million a year. Massive increase and massive opportunity to do more conservation. Walker may talk to you about a project that she was involved in Bridgeport that benefits a disadvantaged community there through the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Program that didn't used to exist at all and now gets $125 million a year. That's what a dedicated land and water conservation fund can do for you. It also changes our sites, our scale of what we think is possible. You're looking here at an 11,000 acre property that was done a few years ago through the Forest Legacy Program, involving a $9 million slug of federal money that prevented the construction. It actually, as the Forest Legacy does, prevented conversion. And the process precluded the construction of over 9,000 houses and 3 golf courses on what is now continued working forest land. That was a big project a few years ago. In 2015, that was a big project for the Forest Legacy Program. With $700 million of new cash and a regular land and water conservation fund infusion, it will not be unusual in the next year for us to see $30 and $40 and $50 million projects every year for the next few years through the Forest Legacy Program. Similarly, increases are seen in the Cooperative Endangered Species Grant Program under LWCF. Here you're looking at not Idaho, but neighboring Montana, where this fund was provided some serious money for acquisition of bull trout and grizzly bear and Canada lynx habitat, but also protected water supply, culinary water supply for the city of Whitefish, Montana. That project took a long time. It would take less time and you'd be able to buy more acreage now that there's more money. Along similar lines.
Alan,
Yes,
this is
ma'am.
your 8-minute warning.
I love it. Migratory Bird Fund. I will quickly go through this with Walker's good advice, but I mentioned this earlier. There was legislation that doubled this fund. As a result, this project that you're about to see that took 8 years will probably just take 1 or 2 years now. It involves land at the Tensaw National Wildlife Refuge. It was the last known sighting of the ivory-billed woodpecker The trees that you see there were critically important for the Louisiana black bear that was listed as threatened in 1992. Most of those forests have been cleared in southern Louisiana for sugar growing and for oil production. You're seeing here a restoration project that was funded with carbon dollars that went along with migratory bird funding that acquired this land for the Fish and Wildlife Service and brought back some of those trees. With the largest ever tree planting on federal land, over 3 million trees at Tensas, the Louisiana black bear has been delisted. That took 8 years. Now it wouldn't take 8 years because there's more money than there used to be. The REPI program, Department of Defense, which you're going to hear more about, I know from Kristen Thomasgard this week, right? That program, again, started small and now it's big. And as it has evolved, what it does is prevents encroachment. And you can see these housing developments bearing down here on Camp Pendleton in Southern California. The Department of Defense provides funding for outside fence line for conservation of lands by non-federal entities through conservation easements and outright purchases to maintain the useful life of their installations, because no one likes to have live ordnance come over the fence and land in their kid's swing set. The North Shore of Hawaii, some of the most noted surfing beaches in America, one of the craziest tourist destinations anywhere. And it's the site, you can see the communication array at the left-hand corner of the screen. It's the site of the Hukuhuku training grounds and the Schofield Barracks. And in order to maintain the privacy of training there, the Department of Army helped to buy 3,600 acres of native forest, including beautiful koa forest on the North Shore of Hawaii. Here you see near New Orleans, it's called the Naval Air Station Joint Reserve Base, New Orleans. It's actually in the city of Belle Chase near New Orleans. City of Belle Chase owns a 202-acre park now through the graces of the Department of the Navy, which didn't want a 600-house development subdivision at the end of their most heavily used runway at this Naval Air Station, because they didn't want 600 families complaining to their congressman that this base was intruding on their life and should be shut down. Agricultural funding. I am, again, not going to stem wine too much. I'm just going to tell you that this funding is not going to double through the Farm Bill, because as you've heard, under the debt limit, the Farm Bill is going to be this year, as it's being negotiated right now, flat from the previous Farm Bill. But in terms of increased funding, that fact may not be as significant as the fact that the Inflation Reduction Act doubles or more than doubles the amount of money available for agricultural easements. And so in Arizona, for instance, where this wonderful rancher named Josiah Austin has a 70,000-acre ranch, he started out working with the ASEP ALE program, when it was still called the Farm and Ranch Land Protection Program, to put easements on 6,000 acres of his 70,000 acres so that he could protect and restore habitat known as sky islands. There are these altitude habitat areas on his ranch where there's habitat unlike anything else in the world, unique habitat. He's using all of the money that he gets from the Department of Agriculture to do restoration. That was a 6,000-acre project. It became a 19,000-acre project. Now with the increase in this program, it's a 33,000-acre project, and I won't be surprised if it does his whole ranch. That's because there's more money in these ag programs. Clean water. You're going to hear much more about this, so I won't stem wine. What I will tell you is that the federal government has invested in states about $100 billion in these revolving funds that states can use for sewer plant upgrades and water protection. The states send that money out as revolving fund money. They charge interest on it to communities that are doing these improvements. Congress has appropriated every year for these programs, for this capitalization of these revolving funds, about $1 billion a year for the Clean Water Revolving Fund, and about $1.5 billion a year for the $1 billion a year for the Drinking Water Revolving Fund, about $1.5 billion, $1.6 billion a year for the Clean Water Revolving Fund, which really does focus on unregulated sewer outfall and other environmental hazards. That money has now not doubled. It's tripled because of money that was made available in the bipartisan infrastructure law. This year and over the next couple of years, the drinking water SRF will be 300% of normal. The clean water revolving fund will be 250% of normal. You will understand what that will do to these famous places like the Delaware watershed, which is the water supply for New York City. And you know that that's a place where iconically they've used these water funds to protect landscapes as a green way of protecting their water supplies. Less known is this water system in the towns of Taunton, New Bedford, and Lakeville, Massachusetts, where they've used little bits of safe drinking water revolving fund just to top off other conservation funding in the Assawampson Pond conservation grand vision of those three towns. And you will hear about this from other folks this week. But if you don't, I'm going to insist that you ask them about when you talk to others about the water revolving funds, about sponsorship programs. The mechanism here is remarkable and remarkably effective. The state of Ohio is using a portion of their clean water revolving fund as an incentive in this interesting way. They're telling folks who apply for loans, if you want to build a new sewer plant, we'll charge you 3%, which is less than market, and you can build that plant with public dollars. If instead you'd like to borrow money at 0.1%, you can do that as long as you give us the difference, that's saved carry cost in cash, so that we can buy something that's on the state's conservation list. I'm going to leave that there as a pregnant idea. You've got to explore that with whoever's going to talk to you more fully about water funding. My last but not least is about resilience funding, which I've mentioned along the way here. It is about FEMA money and preventing disaster damage in the next storm. It's about NOAA coastal funding, that $2.6 billion that's available in the IRA. It's about the $10 billion, 8.7 billion of which is in this brand new program called the PROTECT program that is specifically intended to provide for resilience for transportation infrastructure. Disaster supplemental money. That is deemed emergency money, which means that it's not subject to the budget caps that were just instituted under the debt limit. These are opportunities for money to increase even more from what we already have. You're looking here at a neighborhood that was savaged in the Superstorm Sandy of 2012. That storm took out this neighborhood in the Rockaways of New York City, not only because of the storm damage, but because of the gas line fires that succeeded the storm. It's in an area with a national wildlife refuge and with state conservation areas along a major waterway called Spring Creek. Though the federal government and the state used substantial amounts of Hurricane Sandy money, Superstorm Sandy money, to provide additional resilience, natural protection, land acquisition, and restoration that's reducing flood hazards to those very neighborhoods that were destroyed in Superstorm Sandy. Here you're looking at an area that's going to benefit from the Deepwater Horizon settlement. This is the disappearing delta of the Mississippi River. I do a lot of work here. What you see in beige and in brown and in dingy used to all be green. It all used to be part of the delta. The delta has disappeared and turned into open water. That's going to change with the construction of a $2.5 billion project that's going to bring sediment into those areas and rebuild the delta, benefiting places like this national park that is cheek by jowl near that delta, and that has been the beneficiary of land and water funding in the past. Land is actually going to grow here. There's going to be more upland acreage because of a settlement that came through Deepwater Horizon, through a disaster. And then my very last but not least has to do with this transportation money. If you're lucky enough to live in that paradise of southern Louisiana along Louisiana Highway 1, which you see on the left side of your screen, or at the most dramatic meeting place of sand and sea, as it was termed by the poet Robinson Jeffers, Big Sur, Highway 1 in Louisiana inundates all the time because of high water and sea level rise. The Highway 1 in California disappears all the time because of coastal erosion. Down at the bottom side of your screen, these are interstates near the interstate near Denver, which washes out because of mudslides that follow every year or two's terrible wildfire season, and the bare dirt that then washes out and stops roads. These are resilience issues in transportation. You can deal with them with seawalls, you can deal with them with elevating coastal highways, or you can deal with them with conservation and restoration. That's what these funds can do. Again, I'm going to wrap up here and turn this over to my wonderful, beloved colleagues, to Peter and to Walker, with this admonition to you all. You have seen already in the debt limit discussions that there was an attempt to claw back some of this climate money, $369 billion in the IRA, including some of these programs that I just talked about. That money could be clawed back. It's provided, it's in the bank, it's in OMB expenditure accounts. It's at the Department of Treasury waiting to be spent. It can be spent on conservation, it can be spent on other things, or it could just disappear the next time there's a clawback effort. Our obligation as a community is to get that money spent and to increase the little green slice of the pie chart that I showed you. So I'll stop there and give the meat of this discussion to my two great good friends. But I will stick around for questions, and I'm looking forward to not just talking about how we can do this together, but looking forward to hearing from you after the fact. I'm going to skip over these slides and just show you this and let you know that my contact information is available. And in addition to the mechanisms that you're going to talk to Walker and Peter about on how to get the money, includes talking to folks like me and 1,000 other people who are somewhat fluent in these funding sources. And so looking forward to the discussion to come, and looking forward beyond today to seeing or hearing you all in San Anselmo, New Haven, or elsewhere, and talking about how we can deliver some of these funds for conservation. With that, Peter or Walker, the talking stone is yours.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, well, Alan knows a lot of things. Alan has protected a lot of land, and let's leave Alan. Alan, you can leave your contact information up there, and you can all pepper him with questions into the future, because we're here for networking, right? Okay, so Peter and I are here to add a little bit of extra and to talk about maybe the secret sauce of, okay, Alan just talked about billions of dollars, but how do you get those billions of dollars into your projects? We have 20 minutes for the three of us to talk this through. I am serving here as I guess a funnel of sorts, representing Trust for Public Land. I reached out to a number of colleagues who have reputations for getting a lot of federal money. And I said, okay, tell me, what's the secret sauce? If you had to say it in 4 bullet points, what would you say? So I'm going to try to summarize that a little bit, and then I'll pass it to Peter. So the first thing is, Alan flashed through 2 screenshots, one of grants.gov, one of sam.gov. The whole business of these NOFOs, the offerings of federal funding availability and the application process, it can seem really impersonal. It's a lot of words, it's a lot of documents. And we would say, actually, a lot of this is about relationships. So first off, reach out to federal agency staff, ask questions, try to vet your project. As long as you're talking in generalities and not saying, here, please review this application, they are happy to talk to you. And the bottom line here is, don't waste your time applying for something that isn't a good fit. And also don't waste their time pushing through an application or a proposal that isn't going to go anywhere. That also goes to look at the offering, look at that scoring checklist, get your hands on it, and don't waste space saying things that aren't relevant to the offering. Back to the concept of relationships, and remember that partnerships matter. the way that you describe the partnerships that you're building on the ground, having a mix of public-private partnerships as you go into these proposals is really important, and it demonstrates broader impact, which is part of what these programs are looking for. Remember that these programs, some of them can be very political, and so building relationships with regional, state, federal agency staff, that's an important part of the process. Getting letters of support from your members of Congress, making sure that your members of Congress know about your project, that they are in support of it, and demonstrate that in your applications. Last thing I'll say that is about relationship building, more about partnership and coalition in your local area. Make sure that your project is in alignment with all of the planning. So the local plans, the regional plans, the state plans. Make sure that the work that you're trying to do shows up in all of those plans as they're developed. That means you need to participate in those planning processes as they're going on. We're talking about, local plans of conservation and development, transportation plans, regional plans, making sure that what you're doing is actually getting codified into those plans, and that shows that the work you're doing is important at a larger, broader level. And then the last thing I'll say is tell a story. Yes, you need to use the language that they use, right? So if they're talking about, I'm trying to think of a good example. If they say green infrastructure, maybe don't say rain garden, say green infrastructure, just by way of example. Also use photos, make maps, and don't be scared to make an investment into those products, because if you're spending, I don't just mean photos, like I took a photo with my iPhone. I mean, a professional photographer. Get a professional photographer out to your project. Take photos that really tell the story. It might cost you $1,500, $2,000, but compare that to your $1 million grant or multi-million-dollar grant. It's worth it. Same thing with maps. It costs money. It costs staff time to make those maps. It's worth the investment. Turning it over to Peter.
Great. Thanks, Walker. And I'm so happy to be a sous chef in the master chef Alan Front's kitchen. I want to acknowledge Alan's extraordinary work over the years. He has been really a linchpin of successful efforts at the federal level. This is the heyday of conservation. It may not feel like it, but for anybody that's been around for a while, there's been no time like this. So thank you, Alan. So I'm going to parallel a little bit what Walker said. OSI, the organization that I worked for 20 years, the Open Space Institute, is a regional land trust. We're not national like TPL, but we've secured probably about $60 million in federal funding in the last maybe 2 years for a variety of projects, many of them in the Southeast. We probably helped people, groups that have gotten grants and loans from us, secure probably another 100 million in the last, maybe 8-10 years. But I won't go into transactions, but I am talking a bit from some of the projects that we've done in the Southeast. Now, since Alan has mentioned all the programs, I don't need to hit the swear jar. I mean, we've accessed Forest Legacy, we've accessed LWCF, KELP, NACA, the whole litany of the alphabet soup of programs we've been able to access. And a couple of the lessons from some of these transactions. Some of these are big deals we've done in the Southeast: 16,000 acres, $44 million, 10,000 acres, a big park development project that's probably $40 million. We haven't raised all that. So the key lessons are, just like Walker, relationships are really, really important. The agency people are critical. They should be your best friends. You should be in touch with them all the time to figure out what their priorities and align them with yours. Those are both people that might be at the lower level, but they're also the people that run the agencies. We've been very successful in getting to know the head of the acquisition program in Georgia. His name is Steve Friedman. He has done, if anybody work in Georgia, Okay, you don't know him. He's amazing. Would that there be a Steve Friedman in every single state, but he's played a critical role in assembling funding, matching funding. In fact, in Georgia, a big deal we did, $44 million deal. A third of it was federal, a third was state, a third was philanthropic. The state was critical in helping us reach out to philanthropy. We got a $10 million REPI grant for an easement. We got about a $7 million Forest Legacy grant. And this guy basically put it together. So don't always think you're the smartest person in the room. Sometimes the public agency people are really the puppet masters. And he is an incredible puppet master. The other thing I think we've learned in South Carolina about relationships is that if you can help solve a public agency's problem, they might help solve your problem. So one thing we've done is we've hired in South Carolina a grants administrator who's really knows all the ins and outs of NACA grants and Forest Legacy and all kinds of, and he's written grant proposals for the state for projects other than our own. Now, why would we do that? Well, again, we've helped that person. So when it comes around to our projects that are lining up for funding, we have their attention. And so we've actually acted as shadow government. And I think one of the themes that maybe Ellen, we didn't touch on is that all this money out there, we don't have the capacity for it. We don't have the public sector capacity at the federal level or in many of the states. So that means that sometimes the best investments for an NGO is to lean in and become that shadow government. So related to that example of the grant writer, it's all about the fundraising, stupid. Right? It's all about finding the funding, finding the match. Not every one of those programs has match that Alan detailed, but many of them do. So finding the match is really, really key. And again, that example of the grant writer is maybe illustrative. The other, another key lesson is work the pancake, or as Peter's time would call it, the lasagna. Indy Burke was great in pointing out the multiple kinds of benefits that land conservation achieves last night. Well, your projects often can have multiple benefits, and the more multiple benefits they have, the more potential funding sources they may access, the more that you can use one source to match another source. And that's really the genius here. We've got to get more of this money out, and the more that we can use one program to match another, the more it works like that. There's unlikely sources of funding. We're involved in South Carolina in building a river trail, a 70-mile, 4,000-acre river trail along the Black River. This is a river that adjoins some of the most economically underserved, primarily African-American communities in the state and in the Southeast. We've done a bunch of acquisition that sets the stage for the project, but that's just the beginning of the project. We've done a master plan that indicates we need about $42 million to help develop and link these parks that we've acquired, put in lean-tos and cabin sites for kayaking. So there's a big lift that's coming. We have no idea where that money will come from. So in conversations with Senator Lindsey Graham, I don't know how some of you feel about him, but his staff was very helpful, and they secured a $4.6 million HUD grant. We didn't have that on our radar at all, but it goes to the point of more boxes that your project can click, but also look for unlikely sources. Speaking of Graham, I don't want to say too many nice things about him, but we had an incident, and this goes to my first point about relationships, where a very large project in South Carolina called the Slater Tract, a coastal project, $20 million. We came in right below the line, as Alan will know, on Forest Legacy. Maybe some of you have experienced that if you put a Forest Legacy grant together and you're right below the cutoff, either for the Congress write-up or the final president's budget, hopefully not the final budget. We were right below the line. We desperately needed this for the first phase. We reached out to Graham's office. He helped. The first step was filling out a little application on his website, asking for his help. And we were saying, can you help us get $10 million? Sure enough, he managed to get a $10 million earmark for the project. And that's another thing I'll say. Earmarks used to be dead. They ain't dead anymore. So the politicians that Walker talked about are really important, because with earmarks, that enables politicians to earmark funding for their pet projects in their states. It's horrible business. I mean, it's horrible government. It's not efficient, but it's great for you if you can help your politician find a project that they can go do a ribbon cutting for. And Graham helped us hugely. This project that we did never would have succeeded without that earmark. It was rejected through the normal means, but we got it through the politics. So politics, relationships, funding, these are some of the things that I think really matter if you're going to get this federal money on the ground. So,
Alan, do you have any commentary? And then we'll open it up to questions for our last few minutes.
Commentary requires unmuting, which I've now done, I think. So if you can hear me, I so appreciate your filling in those blanks and talking about the mechanics of getting that money nailed down. I will note the earmark process that Peter talks about, so incredibly important, although in Washington, we don't say earmark because it's still a dirty word. So we call it congressional directed spending or community funded projects. CFP or CDS is going to be more difficult this year than it has been in the past because of the recent past, because of this debt deal and basically the cap on annual appropriations. The one thing that I'd note, and this is maybe more generic, is that these relationships, you've got to go and look at grants.gov. You've got to look at sam.gov and get the date details. You should go to the agency website and find out what kind of projects they funded in the past. And you should get to know the agency staff who are going to make these decisions or who are seminal to the decision making. All that is really important. But as important as Peter talks and Walker talk about these relationships, I just think by way of example, I was working on something in Louisiana a couple of years ago that had a clear track to money that didn't materialize through the normal process. It materialized when there was a disaster supplemental, and someone who was in the process, who was committed enough to the project when it failed the first time, was able to say, well, we can stick this in here. It really is sometimes a marathon, not a sprint, but you need to have people manning the water stations. You've got to have folks who are actually helping you deal with the hot spots and the bunions on your feet. And that's what those relationships allow for. So generally, I would say there are so many different nuances to each of these programs, and the nuances matter. And what matters most is having a buddy and having someone who will serve as Virgil to your Dante and your trip to the underworld, who can help you figure out how to get there.
Questions?
Hi, I'm Matt Singer with Galveston Bay Foundation, and I have a couple of questions that I would like your opinions on. Anyone from the panel can answer. First, if you work in the space of federal grants, you understand that timing is an issue for these projects. And Peter mentioned this or touched on it very briefly, but noting that the federal grant making agencies don't have the capacity to roll this funding out, how are they going to address that capacity issue? And then second, of kind of somewhat related issue, which Peter also mentioned briefly, was matching funding requirements. With increased funding comes increased matching funds requirements. And in a state like Texas, we have a major issue with generating those non-federal dollars. So are these agencies considering waivers for matching funds or reducing the matching funds requirements?
You want to speak to the first part of the matching stuff at the federal level?
Yeah, Alan, did you hear that question?
No, help me out, and then I'll offer something if it's useful.
Okay, so the question, if I was listening, is how is the capacity problem in the federal agencies going to be solved? And what about the match? Are there any, are there ideas for waivers for match requirements?
So Walker, you and Peter can expand on this and probably refine or correct, but I'll just share with you, there are, in terms of capacity, it is very situational, program by program, agency by agency. The National Park Service is in the midst of hiring 120 new people to deal with the stateside program. They will be dealing with everything from helping to build capacity to doing compliance work on the back end. But it's going to take years for them to actually staff up and train up. And so, as Peter talked about it, that capacity issue is a real one. And I would humbly suggest that one of the best things that you can do is come in with projects that are large enough or wrapped up with a bow enough that they achieve some economies of scale. With respect to match, but there isn't a silver bullet here. It's going to take a little time. With respect to match, I think a useful exercise to figure out what funds can match what funds. For instance, when you hear about REPI and you hear about the state side of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, match requirements come down to specific legislative authorities that are in these underlying programs. The REPI program is specifically authorized to match other federal grant programs. So you don't need to find non-federal match if you have REPI money in a project. In fact, the Interior Department a few weeks ago announced this new initiative where they're going to be taking $40 million of unspent REPI money and pairing, or $40 million of unspent stateside land and water conservation fund money, and pairing it up with REPI money, and then providing that money for projects that achieve both ends, with a specific idea that this gets you out of the match requirement. More generally, waivers of match, very difficult to do. The Outdoors for All Act, which is pending in Congress right now, it's part of the recreation package that's working its way through the authorizing committees. That program would allow for a match for disadvantaged communities for outdoor recreation legacy partnership fund funded projects. That might happen this year. It might happen this Congress. If it does, it will be the outlier. It'll be the exception. In general, there is a general sense in Congress that if we authorized a program that requires some skin in the game from applicants and communities, that we're not just going to willy-nilly take that away. So it comes down to specifics. It's worth having the discussion with agency folks. It's worth having the discussion with us based on the specifics that you're working on in Galveston Bay or any of you are working on elsewhere. But waiving match is a complicated affair, but it's not impossible.
Thanks, Alan. Really quickly, this is a historic opportunity for philanthropy to bridge these federal investments. In several big deals we've done in Georgia, we've gotten money grants from foundations. They gave it to us early, so we kind of used it as a loan to secure an initial option or first phase to ensure that we protected land, even if other phases didn't come through. I think being able to make the case to foundations that the ability to bring this money down hinges on getting very low cost, flexible, long-term PRI money. There's never been a better case to be made. I'm not sure we're making it as well as we should, but I'd be more than willing to help with that case.
Okay, we'll take one more question. Peter, do you want to put your hand back up? Did I scare people? Okay. We have a question.
Hello, Libby Kamalu, World Wildlife Fund, also supporting Buffalo Nation's Grasslands Alliance in a hybrid role. The question that keeps coming to my mind is, hearing about land water conservation fund money and, the Dingle, Johnson, Pittman, Roberts money that goes to states, but that tribes are not eligible for. I know Recovering America's Wildlife Act will move a major needle on that if it's passed, fingers crossed, to dedicate about $97 million to tribes across the US each year. My question is for you, Alan, if you can speak to any other changes you've seen for funds that tribes are eligible for in the pieces of legislation that have come through, and any advice that you have about accessing federal funds. I know it's a pretty general question. Thank you.
No, it's an important, if general question, and there are a couple of different wrinkles, and I know our time is short, so I'll just share. There are bills like the Outdoors for All Act that are looking to correct these tribal inequities by dealing tribes into programs from which they're currently blocked. It is very sporadic. And there are organizations like the Trust for Public Land and many of our colleagues who are committed to tribal land return, not just for conservation's sake, but for economic sustainability for First Nations. And we have been looking at different ways to address that. Watch the Farm Bill, because I think there will be some changes to programs and potentially a new program created through the Farm Bill that would specifically benefit tribes. It is slow going, because, and these inequities have lasted for a very long time. I would note that there have been some very successful conservation initiatives with tribes. TPL, blow our own horn and say that TPL, organization that I remain connected to, even though I no longer work there, has returned more land to tribes than any other organization in America, tribal or non-tribally led. And a lot of that has come through settlements. And settlements are still a good place to look if there are inequities that are legal in nature that can result in basically a sue and settle approach that has the federal government providing more money for tribes. That's a way into it. The Interior Department is trying to figure out how to get $12 million this year of LWCF money into tribes. So it's coming in slow bits. But Libby, what I'd say is, since our time is short, you should call me and we can talk about this a bit more. But there are possibilities, and there also is a whole lot of inequity that still persists.
And with that, let's say thank you to Alan for joining us.